There's been a lot of very bad information going on with regards to the DHS memo about photography, and I'd like to clear up some of those by actually going through the document so that you can see what it is and what it isn't. I think most people are relying on hearsay and spur of the moment statements from auditors and drawing conclusions without actually having read the document. So let's start off with the document itself. This is from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service Threat Management Division. So it will apply to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service. That's the Federal Protective Service is a sub-branch of the DHS. It's organized under the National Protection and Programs Division. I don't know why they name it's the NPPD. Anyway, so what is this document that we're looking at? It is an FPS information bulletin. It is an information bulletin for the FPS, by the FPS, to the FPS. It's an FPS information bulletin. It was made on 8/12/2010. It's a about 8-year-old document, 7.5-year-old document at the point I'm recording this. So it may have been replaced. We don't know, because you have to remember that this was for official use only. It was not disseminated to the public until recently. There may be a newer information bulletin. Not that it matters, because it's an information bulletin. It's not law. So, but this may be outdated. Dissemination list. This is who they sent this out to. So this is important. They send it out to the people who need it. So who do they send it out to? They sent it out to FPS management, FPS law enforcement, and protective security officers. Now, some terms of art. When they refer to law enforcement subsequently, if they don't specify, it is FPS law enforcement. Because this is from FPS to FPS by FPS. So you have to remember that. It's to FPS law enforcement. You have to read the whole document. You have to take your context from the whole document. If somebody cuts out one sentence out of a 2 or 3 page document and says, "Oh, this is the issue, this is the binding thing," then they're probably being disingenuous. And protective security officers, those are just private security guards that are hired by FPS to assist them in their protecting of certain federal leases and properties. So protective security officers, they're just private security guards. They don't have law enforcement capabilities. They're security guards. So, photographing the exterior of federal buildings. This information bulletin, again, it's an information bulletin. It's not law. It's intended to raise the awareness of FPS personnel management and protective security officers. Remember, this is an FPS document for FPS personnel. Of the public's right to photograph the exterior of federal facilities. I'm going to focus on this a lot because you'll notice that pretty much everything in this says you can photograph the outside of federal facilities. And that's 2 key things that you need to remain aware of, even if this isn't law. But you have to remember that you can photograph the outside of federal facilities from public spaces, which probably needs a video on its own because it's not anyway. So, exterior of federal facilities. All information contained within this document was blah blah blah. All right. So, overview. This information bulletin, IB, not law, is being released to raise the awareness of the public's right to photograph the exterior of federally owned and leased facilities. And then we have some redacted things here. We don't know what that is or why, but that's what we got. Law enforcement and PSOs. Again, these are FPS law enforcement and PSOs because this document was made by, to, and for FPS. Are advised to review the guidance provided in this IB when encountering individuals photographing or videotaping the exterior of federal buildings and apply the guidance in the performance of their everyday duties to enhance the protection of federal facilities. So this is a tool for them, and we'll get to where they actually give people guidance, but it's a tool for them in how to approach the public. It's not law. It's important that law enforcement, again, FPS law enforcement and PSOs, uphold the public's general right to photograph the exterior of federal structures while being vigilant with respect to suspicious indicators of terrorist or criminal activity. Now, this section right here under details, this Title 41, Section 102-74.420 of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, provides federal policy concerning photographs for news, advertisement, commercial purposes. This is law. Title 41, CFR 102-74.420, that's law. So everything in here, right here, this part down to C, is actual law. But if you are going to quote this law at people, you probably want to actually quote it from the CFR, because that's the law. This is, if you show them the memo, you're not going to get too far. The law is actually the law. But the law probably won't help you as much as you think it will, because it states, except where security regulations, rules, orders, or directives apply, or a federal court order or rule prohibits it, persons entering in or on federal property may take photographs of... Okay, so let's just stop there for a second. So it says, except where these things prohibit it, and these things are the security regulations, rules, orders, or directives, or federal court order or rule. So those things can prohibit it. Now, there may be a constitutional challenge to this on the First Amendment, but if we're just looking at the statute allows for times where even outside or whatever, the government does have some control over when, where, and how you can take photographs. Now, there's always going to be a legal analysis of this, so don't just jump in here and be like, oh, well, my First Amendment. Yes, your First Amendment does apply, but you have to remember that there are times and places where the court can, like a federal court, you can't take photographs in a criminal proceeding in federal court. You can't do it. It is just outright prohibited by the court. You won't be able to do it. No court will accept your First Amendment case to try to get filming of criminal procedures, because the court has already ruled that a defendant's right to due process trumps your right to film. It trumps the right to gather the news with photographs, and it trumps your right to freedom of expression by filming and creating art out of these things. Their Fifth Amendment due process rights trump your First Amendment rights to film a criminal trial in federal court. State courts may vary, but in federal court, you can't film. Now, you can attend a criminal trial. You'll see people sketching pictures of like what the court looks like at particular times and places, but there will not be photos, because the courts have determined that the Fifth Amendment due process trumps First Amendment freedom of news gathering and freedom of expression. So there you go. Sorry, long story long. So now we move on. So there are places you can prohibit it, but people can take photographs on federal property of space occupied by a tenant agency for non-commercial purposes only with the permission of the occupying agency concerned. So if you want to take non-commercial photos of a tenant agency, like somebody like who's leased space or who owns or who's occupying that federal property, if you want to take pictures of that space, the internal space, then you got to get their, you have to get their permission for non-commercial purposes. Okay. Space occupied, and we're on B. Space occupied by a tenant agency for commercial purposes. You have to get written permission of an authorized official of the occupying agency concerned. So for non-commercial purposes, you could just get permission. For commercial purposes, it has to be written permission. And there is a reason. First Amendment law, there are fewer protections on commercial speech than there are on non-commercial speech. That's just First Amendment law, constitutional law. So then we're on C, building entrances, foyers, lobbies, corridors, or auditoriums for news purposes. So if there is something newsworthy going on in the building entrance, lobby, foyer, corridors, or auditoriums, for FPS, actually we're in actual law. So if there's news purposes, according to this title, now there may be others that limit it, building entrances, lobbies, foyers, corridors, or auditoriums for news purposes, you can film, provided there are no security regulations, rules, orders, directives that apply, or a federal court order or rule prohibiting it. So there you go. That was the law portion. So this Title 41, that's law, but everything else is just memo. All right, so we're back into the FPS portion of the memo. For properties under the protective jurisdiction of FPS, so they're telling you that they're being very specific. There are currently no general meaning applying to all of them, security regulations prohibiting exterior photography of any federally owned or leased building absent a written local rule. So they are saying here there could be a written local rule or regulation by a court security committee or facility security committee. So there's no general one. There's no nationwide general security regulation prohibiting the exterior photography of any federally owned building, but there may be local ones. So you, as an auditor, should be aware that there still may be a local rule prohibiting what you're doing. And again, there may be a First Amendment challenge to that, and we're not getting into that here, but just be aware there may be. Furthermore, it is important to understand this regulation does not prohibit photography by individuals of the exterior of federally owned or leased facilities from publicly accessible spaces such as streets, sidewalks, parks, and plazas. Rather, this regulation only prescribes, that means it only prohibits, photography of the interior of federal buildings, i.e. space occupied by a tenant agency. So what they're saying here is their interpretation of this law is that space occupied by a tenant agency means the actual inside interior spaces. I had kind of assumed that when I was reading the law, but I've read this document several times, so I should have made that clear. But their interpretation of that regulation, of that law, is that space occupied by a tenant agency refers to the actual interior space. And they are also saying that the regulation prescribes photography in the building entrances, lobbies, foyers, corridors, or auditoriums. Unless it's for news purposes. Therefore, absent reasonable suspicion or probable cause, law enforcement and security personnel must allow individuals to photograph the exterior of federally owned or leased facilities from publicly accessible spaces. Now again, law enforcement security personnel here are FPS law enforcement and the PSOs, the security personnel, the private security that they've hired. And you know this because the next section is guidance for FPS law enforcement officers encountering individuals taking photographs of the exterior of federal buildings. So then they say, you know, oh, you approach, identify yourself, conduct your field interview. So this is where you can say, oh, if they don't identify themselves, this is where you could legit say, oh, well, isn't it your policy to identify yourself? I mean, this would actually be a case where there is a policy that they identify themselves. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to give you their name. Identify yourself, absent some clarifying thing, could just be to identify yourself as an FPS law enforcement officer. Hi, I'm a FPS law enforcement officer. I am here to conduct a field interview. It doesn't say they have to give their name, but maybe. I mean, you wouldn't sound foolish if you said, oh, isn't it your policy to identify yourself? And maybe they'll give you their name. But it says that they get to conduct a field interview. That's the voluntary, that's the consensual contact. And it goes on to say the initial interview is voluntary. It says they should not seize your camera or the contents, and that's without some sort of probable cause. So it also does say that that photographers can't impede law enforcement operations or the egress, the going in, coming out of people or vehicles entering the facility. And then there's the guidance for PSOs. These are the FPS, protective security officers, encountering individuals taking photographs. Again, they conduct field interviews, but they don't go on to detention, I don't believe. I think they probably are instructed to, if they believe they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause, they are probably instructed to call the police or other FPS law enforcement agencies. So then you have references. It references the CFR. That's the law. It also references FPS memorandum. I don't have a copy of that. I can't find it online. But that would be a memorandum. Again, would not be law. It would just be policy. You know that this is from, by, for, and to FPS because for immediate reporting of any incidents, contact the FPS. For further queries regarding the above bulletin or questions regarding the dissemination process, please contact the FPS Intelligence Branch. So this document is from, by, and for the FPS. It is policy. It's internal FPS policy. It is not law. And it does not give you any rights above and beyond what the CFR, the regulation is for photographing the outside of buildings. Your best bet is unless there is some other document or policy, you could try throwing out, well, hey, I'm shooting this for news purposes. That may get you in there, but you got to remember that if security regulations, rules, orders, directives apply, then that still goes away. Barring some First Amendment process, but you'd have to get a court to determine that for you. So I hope this clears it up. The FPS Information Bulletin does not apply to post offices. Post offices, they have their own. They use the postal inspectors. It doesn't apply to courts, federal courts, because that's the U.S. Marshals, and they've probably got their own internal bulletins. But you also have to remember that even the places where this does apply, by the way, it doesn't apply to military bases because those are Department of Defense. It doesn't apply to the FBI because those are Department of Justice. This only applies to the FPS. It is only policy. It's not law. And the best thing this can do, like the ultimate this will do, is get somebody fired or written up, and you won't know anything about it because they'll do all that internally, and they won't tell you that they slapped some FPS law enforcement officer on the wrist for violating your rights. So again, before you do any auditing, before you go out there, I always recommend talk to an attorney, find out what's legal, what's probably legal, I should say, where you're probably okay filming from, where you're probably not okay filming from. Always have a lawyer represent you in court. Don't talk to the police without a lawyer present. Just please, that's free legal advice. And be very wary. Check what I've said. Talk to an attorney about what I've said, but definitely talk to an attorney about what these other guys have said. I know that there's a lot of bad information about this being disseminated out there. It's very much akin to the sovereign citizen stuff. It's very much akin to the flat earth stuff. It's just patently wrong. Do your research, do your homework, but for the love of God, talk to an attorney before you trust any one of these YouTube activists who aren't attorneys. Thanks for watching, and have yourself a wonderful day.